The sound of laughter echoed across the sprawling backyard of the Henderson family estate in Savannah, Georgia. Standing there in my carefully chosen coral sundress, clutching a homemade peach cobbler that had taken me 3 hours to perfect, I felt the eyes of 47 family members burning into my skin like the oppressive July heat. "Oh, that's just Sarah," Michael had announced to his cousin's wife, his voice dripping with condescension as he gestured dismissively in my direction. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." She thinks she's some kind of chef because she watches those cooking shows all day. Honestly, Lisa, you should see the disasters she creates in our kitchen. I keep telling her to stick to ordering takeout, but she insists on embarrassing us at every family gathering. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had spent weeks preparing for this reunion, researching family recipes, practicing techniques, and putting my heart into every dish I planned to contribute. The peach cobbler in my hands wasn't just dessert, it was my attempt to finally earn acceptance from Michael's family after 3 years of marriage. 3 years of feeling like an outsider looking in at their tight-knit Southern clan. My name is Sarah Mitchell, though it used to be Sarah Caldwell before I married into the Henderson dynasty of Savannah. At 29, I thought I had found my place in the world as the wife of Michael Henderson, a successful real estate developer whose family had been fixtures in Georgia high society for generations. I had moved from my modest hometown of Athens, Georgia, leaving behind my job as a high school English teacher and my small circle of friends to become part of what I believed was a loving, supportive family. How naive I had been. The Henderson family reunion was an annual tradition that took place every summer at the family's antebellum mansion on the outskirts of Savannah. The property had been in their family for over a century, complete with moss-draped oak trees, manicured gardens, and a sense of history that intimidated me from the moment I first stepped foot on the grounds. This year marked my third attendance, and I had been determined to finally prove that I belonged. I had arrived early that morning, my car loaded with dishes I had prepared with meticulous care. Along with the peach cobbler, I had made shrimp and grits using a recipe I had found in an old Charleston cookbook, homemade biscuits with honey butter, and a traditional Brunswick stew that had required hours of slow cooking. Each dish represented my attempt to honor the culinary traditions that seemed so important to Michael's family. The morning had started promisingly enough. Michael's grandmother, whom everyone called Mima, had complimented my dress and thanked me for bringing so many contributions to the meal. His younger sister, Rebecca, had even asked for my biscuit recipe, which had filled me with hope that perhaps this year would be different. Perhaps this year I would finally feel like part of the family instead of a tolerated outsider. But as the day progressed, I began to notice the subtle signs that should have warned me about what was coming. Michael had been drinking steadily since we arrived, starting with mimosas during the morning socializing and progressing to bourbon as the afternoon wore on. His voice had grown louder with each drink, and his comments about me had become increasingly cutting. When I offered to help his Aunt Martha in the kitchen, Michael had loudly announced that I was probably just trying to spy on the family recipes because I couldn't come up with anything original on my own. When I attempted to join a conversation about local politics, he had interrupted to remind everyone that I was just a small-town teacher who wouldn't understand the complexities of business and development. Each comment had stung, but I had convinced myself that Michael was just nervous about his recent business pressures and was taking it out on me inappropriately. I had made excuses for his behavior, as I had been doing for months, telling myself that the stress of his work was making him act out of character. The moment that shattered my illusions came when I approached Michael and his cousin's wife Lisa, who was visiting from Charleston. Lisa was everything I wasn't: tall, blonde, effortlessly elegant, and born into the kind of old Southern money that gave her an automatic place in society that I would never achieve no matter how hard I tried. She had been polite to me in previous encounters, but there had always been an underlying coolness that made me feel inadequate. I had approached them hoping to offer Lisa a slice of my peach cobbler, thinking that perhaps sharing food might bridge whatever gap existed between us. The cobbler had turned out beautifully, with a golden crust and perfectly seasoned filling that smelled like summer itself. I was proud of it in a way that felt almost childish, but it represented hours of work and genuine care. That's when Michael had delivered his devastating assessment of my cooking abilities, his words carrying across the yard and drawing the attention of family members who had been engaged in their own conversations. The laughter that had followed his comments felt like a chorus of judgment, and I realized that I had been the subject of family jokes for far longer than I had known. Bless her heart, Lisa had responded with the kind of false sympathy that Southern women had perfected as an art form. It's so sweet that she tries so hard. Maybe you should suggest she take some cooking classes, Michael. I know a wonderful chef in Charleston who works with beginners. The conversation had continued around me as if I weren't standing there, holding my beautiful cobbler and feeling my face burn with humiliation. Other family members had joined in with their own stories about my previous culinary attempts, each anecdote delivered with the kind of affectionate mockery that felt more cruel than outright hostility. I learned that my attempt at making cornbread for last year's reunion had been compared to hockey pucks in family conversations for months afterward. My green bean casserole had apparently been quietly thrown away after everyone had politely taken small portions. Even my contribution to Easter dinner, a carrot cake I had spent an entire day making, had been the subject of family jokes about my creative interpretation of traditional recipes. Standing there in the oppressive heat, surrounded by the laughter of people I had been trying so desperately to impress, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The humiliation was overwhelming, but beneath it was a growing anger that I had never allowed myself to fully experience. How long had Michael been participating in these conversations about me? How many times had he laughed at my efforts while pretending to support me at home? I excused myself quietly, walking toward the house with as much dignity as I could muster while carrying my rejected cobbler. The kitchen was mercifully empty, and I set the dish on the counter next to the elaborate spread of food that had been prepared by the family's longtime cook and various female relatives who had learned their skills from generations of tradition. Looking at my cobbler next to their perfectly executed dishes, I could see the differences that my untrained eye had missed. The crust wasn't quite as flaky as it should have been, and the filling had a slightly runny consistency that suggested I hadn't gotten the thickening quite right. But it was still a beautiful dessert that had been made with love and considerable effort, and it didn't deserve the ridicule it had received. I stood in the kitchen for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened and figure out how I wanted to respond. Part of me wanted to leave immediately, to walk out to my car and drive back to Athens where I could hide in my childhood bedroom and pretend this marriage had never happened. But another part of me, a part that I was just beginning to recognize, wanted to stay and fight back against the people who had made me feel so small. That's when I heard voices coming from Michael's father's study, a room that was typically off-limits during family gatherings. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear Michael's voice clearly, along with those of his father, Robert, and his uncle William. Curiosity overrode my sense of propriety, and I moved closer to listen to what seemed to be a heated discussion. Michael, you need to understand the seriousness of this situation, Robert was saying, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had made him successful in business for over 30 years. The zoning committee is asking questions that we can't answer without exposing the whole operation. If they dig too deep into the Riverside development, they're going to discover irregularities that could bring down the entire company. Dad, I've got everything under control, Michael replied, but there was a tension in his voice that I had never heard before. The permits were processed through the proper channels, and we have documentation for everything. Even if they investigate, they won't find anything that can be traced back to us personally. That's not what William is telling me, Robert continued. William, explain to your nephew exactly what the environmental inspector found last week. William's voice was quieter, but I could still make out his words clearly. The soil samples from the Riverside property show contamination levels that should have prevented any development permits from being approved. Someone in the zoning office either didn't do their job properly, or they were convinced to overlook the results. Either way, if this becomes public knowledge, we're looking at criminal charges, not just civil penalties. My heart began to race as I realized I was overhearing a conversation about illegal activities that involved my husband and his family's business. The Riverside development was a project that Michael had been working on for over a year, a luxury housing complex that was supposed to be his big break into the family's inner circle of business operations. The inspector is asking for additional documentation about the environmental impact studies, William continued. If we can't produce legitimate studies that support the permits that were issued, he's going to recommend that the project be shut down immediately and that the matter be referred to the district attorney's office for investigation. Can't we just pay him to look the other way? Michael asked, his voice betraying a casual attitude toward corruption that shocked me. It worked with the zoning committee members. A few $1,000s each, and they were happy to expedite our permits without asking too many questions. The silence that followed Michael's question was deafening. I pressed closer to the door, straining to hear Robert's response. Michael, you just admitted to bribing public officials, Robert said slowly, his voice filled with what sounded like a mixture of anger and disbelief. Please tell me you're not serious about trying to bribe a state environmental inspector. Why not? Michael replied defensively. It's worked for every other project we've done. You taught me that sometimes you have to grease the wheels to get things done in this business. What's the difference between buying a zoning committee member dinner and giving him an envelope with cash in it? The difference is about 20 years in federal prison, William interjected sharply. Michael, your father and I have bent some rules over the years, but we've never engaged in outright bribery of state officials. What you're describing could bring down not just you, but the entire family business. I felt my legs growing weak, as the implications of what I was hearing began to sink in. Michael had been bribing government officials to approve development projects that violated environmental regulations. The family business that I had been so eager to become part of was apparently built on a foundation of corruption and illegal activities. Look, the inspector is scheduled to meet with me again next Friday, Michael said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. If we can't find a way to make this problem disappear, we're all going to be in serious trouble. Sarah doesn't know anything about any of this, so at least she can't be implicated if everything falls apart. Thank God for small favors, Robert muttered. Michael, I want you to understand something very clearly. If you try to bribe that inspector and get caught, you're on your own. This family will not go down to protect you from your own stupidity. The conversation continued, but I had heard enough to understand that my husband was involved in criminal activities that could land him in prison for decades. More importantly, I realized that the family I had been trying so desperately to impress was a criminal organization disguised as a respectable business dynasty. I backed away from the study door on shaking legs, my mind reeling with the implications of what I had just discovered. The humiliation I had felt about my cooking suddenly seemed trivial compared to the realization that I was married to a criminal who saw me as nothing more than a convenient cover for his illegal activities. Walking back toward the kitchen, I tried to process the competing emotions that were overwhelming me. Horror at discovering my husband's crimes, warred with relief at finally understanding why I had never been accepted by his family. They hadn't been rejecting me because I wasn't good enough for their social circle. They had been keeping me at arm's length because I was an outsider who couldn't be trusted with their secrets. The kitchen was still empty when I returned, and I found myself staring at my peach cobbler while trying to decide what to do with the information I had just obtained. Part of me wanted to pretend I had never heard the conversation, to go back outside and continue playing the role of the inadequate wife who was grateful for whatever scraps of acceptance the family threw her way. But another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger throughout the day, was tired of being underestimated and dismissed. These people had spent 3 years making me feel small and insignificant, while hiding the fact that they were criminals who saw me as a useful fool. The teacher in me who had spent years standing up to difficult students and demanding parents wasn't going to let this slide. I took out my phone and began recording a voice memo, speaking quietly but clearly as I recounted everything I had just overheard. The conversation about bribing zoning officials, the environmental contamination that had been covered up, and the casual discussion of criminal activities that could result in federal charges. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with the recording, but I knew that documenting what I had learned was the first step toward protecting myself. As I finished the recording, I heard footsteps approaching the kitchen and quickly put my phone away. Michael appeared in the doorway, his face flushed from alcohol and heat, carrying an empty bourbon glass that he refilled from a bottle on the counter. "There you are," he said, his words slightly slurred. "Lisa was asking about your cobbler. I told her you probably used the wrong kind of peaches or something. You know how these fancy Charleston people are about their desserts." Looking at my husband as he casually insulted my efforts while hiding his criminal activities, I felt a clarity that I hadn't experienced in years. This man had been systematically undermining my confidence while using me as cover for illegal business practices. He had encouraged me to quit my teaching job and become dependent on him financially, while secretly viewing me as a liability who had to be kept in the dark about his real activities. Michael, I need to ask you something, I said, keeping my voice steady, despite the anger that was building inside me. Are you happy in our marriage? The question seemed to catch him off guard, and he looked at me with the kind of confusion that suggested he hadn't given much thought to my happiness, or his own, in quite some time. What kind of question is that? He replied, taking a long drink from his refilled glass. Of course I'm happy. We have a good life, don't we? Nice house, financial security, family connections. What more could you want? Respect, I said simply. I could want respect. Michael laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Sarah, you're being dramatic, so I made a joke about your cooking. It's not the end of the world. Everyone knows you're still learning how to fit in with the family. Fit in with a family of criminals, you mean? The words were out of my mouth before I had consciously decided to say them, and I watched Michael's face go white as he processed what I had just said. The bourbon glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the kitchen floor, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. What did you just say? He whispered, his eyes darting toward the study, where his father and uncle were presumably still discussing their illegal activities. I heard your conversation with your father and uncle, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. I know about the bribes, the environmental violations, and the federal crimes you've been committing. I know about all of it, Michael. Michael's shock quickly transformed into anger, and he stepped toward me with a threatening expression that I had never seen before. You were eavesdropping on a private family conversation. How dare you spy on us in my father's house? How dare you make me an unwitting accomplice to your crimes? I shot back, standing my ground, despite his intimidating posture. How dare you let me believe that I was the problem in this marriage, when you've been lying to me about who you really are? Sarah, you don't understand what you heard. Michael said, his voice taking on a pleading tone, as he seemed to realize the implications of my discovery. It's not as bad as it sounds. Sometimes business requires making difficult decisions, but it's not really criminal. It's just the way things work in development. Bribing government officials is a federal crime, Michael, I replied, drawing on my knowledge from teaching civics classes for several years. Covering up environmental violations that could harm public health is a criminal conspiracy. There's no gray area here. You and your family are criminals. Michael's expression shifted again, this time to calculation, as he seemed to be weighing his options for dealing with my knowledge of his activities.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Sarah, you're my wife, he said slowly. That means you can't be forced to testify against me in court. Spousal privilege protects both of us as long as we stay married. You need to think very carefully about what you're saying and what you're planning to do with information that could destroy not just me, but your own financial security. The threat was clear, though it was delivered with the kind of false reasonableness that Michael had perfected over the years. He was reminding me that I was financially dependent on him and that destroying him would also destroy my comfortable lifestyle. But he was also revealing that he saw our marriage as nothing more than a legal shield that protected him from prosecution. Are you threatening me, Michael? I asked, pulling out my phone and holding it where he could see it clearly. Because I should mention that I've already recorded everything I overheard, and I'm perfectly capable of sending that recording to several people with just a few taps on the screen. Michael's face went white again as he realized that I had documented his family's criminal activities. Sarah, you don't know what you're getting yourself into. These aren't people you want to cross. My family has connections throughout this state, and they don't take kindly to threats. Then they shouldn't have spent 3 years treating me like I was stupid, I replied, feeling a surge of power that was both terrifying and exhilarating. If you had treated me with respect, if you had been honest about who you really were, we might have been able to work something out. But you chose to humiliate me while using me as cover for your crimes. The sound of voices approaching the kitchen interrupted our confrontation, and Michael quickly moved to block my path to the door. Sarah, we're going to walk out of here together, and you're going to act like nothing has happened. We'll finish out the reunion, go home, and discuss this privately like civilized people. No, I said firmly, pushing past him toward the kitchen door. I'm done pretending to be the grateful little wife who doesn't know what's really going on. I'm done being embarrassed by you and your family, and I'm definitely done protecting you from the consequences of your own choices. Michael grabbed my arm as I reached for the door handle, his grip tight enough to leave bruises. Sarah, I'm warning you, don't do something you'll regret for the rest of your life. The only thing I regret is wasting 3 years of my life on a man who saw me as nothing more than useful camouflage. I replied, yanking my arm free from his grip. You want to know what I'm going to do next, Michael? I'm going to walk out to that backyard, and I'm going to tell your entire family exactly what kind of criminals they're protecting. You wouldn't dare, Michael whispered, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Watch me, I said, opening the kitchen door and stepping out into the oppressive heat of the Georgia afternoon. The backyard was still filled with family members enjoying their reunion, completely unaware that their comfortable world was about to be shattered by the small-town teacher they had spent years dismissing as inadequate. I could see Lisa near the dessert table, probably still discussing my poor cooking skills with whoever would listen. Robert and William had emerged from the study and were talking quietly with Mima near the oak trees. Everyone looked so comfortable, so secure in their assumption that their secrets were safe and their criminal activities would remain hidden behind the facade of Southern respectability. They had no idea that the woman they had been laughing at all afternoon was about to expose them all. I walked toward the center of the gathering, my heart pounding but my resolve stronger than it had ever been. Behind me, I could hear Michael's footsteps as he followed, probably hoping to stop me before I could reveal what I had learned. But it was too late for damage control. The naive, desperate-to-please wife they had been manipulating for 3 years was gone, replaced by someone who was tired of being underestimated and ready to fight back. The conversation I was about to have would change everything, not just for Michael and his criminal family, but for me as well. I was about to burn down the life I had built in Savannah, but I was also about to reclaim the self-respect that I had been giving away in small pieces for far too long. As I approached the group near the dessert table, I took a deep breath and prepared to deliver the shock that would end my marriage and expose the Henderson family's criminal empire. The woman who had arrived that morning, hoping to finally gain acceptance, was about to leave as someone who demanded nothing less than justice. The silence that followed my announcement was deafening. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence as 47 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me with expressions ranging from confusion to outright horror. I stood in the center of the gathering, feeling the weight of their collective gaze, but for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't intimidated by their attention. I'm sorry, what did you just say? Mima asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she clutched her mint julep with trembling hands. I said that your grandson and his father have been bribing government officials to approve development projects that violate environmental regulations. I repeated clearly, my voice carrying across the yard with the same authority I had used to command attention in my high school classrooms. Michael just finished discussing with Robert and William how they're going to handle the environmental inspector who discovered contamination at the Riverside development. The explosion of voices that erupted was immediate and chaotic. Family members began talking over each other, some demanding explanations, others accusing me of lying, and still others trying to understand what I was talking about. Through the cacophony, I could hear Michael behind me, frantically trying to control the damage. Sarah's been drinking, he announced loudly, moving to stand beside me with his hand on my shoulder, in what probably looked like a supportive gesture but felt like a warning. She's confused about a conversation she overheard. You know how women can be when they've had too much wine in this heat. The casual sexism of his dismissal ignited something fierce inside me. After years of being talked down to and treated like a decoration, I was done being diminished by this man and his criminal family. I haven't had a single drink today, Michael, I said, shrugging away from his touch. And I wasn't confused about anything I heard. You specifically mentioned paying several $1,000s each to zoning committee members to expedite permits without proper review. You also discussed bribing a state environmental inspector to ignore contamination that should have prevented development approval. Robert Henderson stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and what looked like panic. Young lady, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but you're making very serious accusations against respected members of this community. I suggest you reconsider your words very carefully. Are you threatening me, Robert? I asked, pulling out my phone and holding it up for everyone to see, because I should mention that I recorded the entire conversation. Every word about bribes, contamination cover-ups, and federal crimes is documented on this device. The color drained from Robert's face as the implications of my statement sank in. Around us, family members began to understand that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a dramatic outburst from an overwrought wife. This was a serious accusation, backed by evidence that could destroy the foundation of their family's wealth and reputation. William Henderson pushed through the crowd, his face twisted with rage. "You little spy," he snarled, lunging toward my phone. "Give me that device right now." I stepped back quickly, holding the phone away from his reaching hands. "Don't touch me, William. Attempting to destroy evidence of federal crimes is itself a federal crime. You're already in enough trouble without adding obstruction of justice to your charges." "Sarah, please," Michael said, his voice taking on a desperate pleading tone that I had never heard before. "You don't understand what you're doing. These people aren't just business associates. They're family. We can work this out privately without involving outsiders." "The environmental inspector you're planning to bribe is an outsider?" I asked. "The federal agents who will investigate these crimes are outsiders." "Michael, you've already involved outsiders. I'm just making sure the right outsiders get involved." Lisa, Michael's cousin's wife, stepped forward with the kind of cold composure that came from years of handling social crises. "Sarah, I think you're having some kind of emotional breakdown. This behavior is completely inappropriate for a family gathering. Perhaps you should go inside and rest until you feel better." The patronizing tone that had once made me feel small now just made me angry. These people had spent years treating me like I was stupid, and they were still doing it even as I exposed their criminal activities. "Lisa, I'm a college-educated woman with a master's degree in education," I replied calmly. "I've taught civics classes for 7 years, and I understand exactly what constitutes federal crimes. There's nothing emotional or inappropriate about exposing criminal behavior. What's inappropriate is using a family business to commit fraud and endanger public health." Rebecca, Michael's younger sister, approached with tears in her eyes. She had always been the family member who treated me with the most genuine kindness, and seeing her distress was harder than dealing with the others' hostility. "Sarah, I don't understand what's happening," she said softly. "These are serious accusations you're making. Are you sure you heard what you think you heard?" Looking at Rebecca's confused and hurt expression, I felt a pang of regret for the pain my revelations were causing. But I also realized that she, like me, had probably been kept in the dark about the family's criminal activities. Her genuine shock suggested that the corruption wasn't universal within the family. "Rebecca, I'm sorry that you're learning about this the same way I did," I said gently. "But your brother and father have been committing federal crimes that could send them to prison for decades. The Riverside Development Project was approved through bribery, and they're planning to bribe a state inspector to cover up environmental contamination that could harm public health." "That's impossible," Rebecca said, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. "Daddy would never do anything illegal. The business has always been completely legitimate." "Has it, Rebecca?" I asked. "Or have you, like me, been kept away from the real business discussions? When was the last time you were included in a meeting about project approvals or permit processes?" I could see the doubt creeping into Rebecca's expression as she began to process my questions. Like me, she had probably been excluded from family business discussions under the guise of protecting her from boring details, when the real reason was to protect the family from her potential disapproval or legal liability. Mima set down her mint julep with shaking hands and walked toward the house without saying a word. Her reaction spoke louder than any denial or accusation could have. The matriarch of the family knew exactly what I was talking about, and her silence was as damning as any confession. Other family members began to scatter as the implications of my accusations sank in. Some headed toward their cars, apparently deciding that they didn't want to be present for whatever was going to happen next. Others huddled in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about damage control and legal exposure. Michael grabbed my arm again, his grip even tighter than before. "Sarah, we're leaving right now. You've said enough for one day. Take your hands off me," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. If you touch me again, I'll add assault to the list of crimes I'm reporting to the authorities. Michael released my arm but moved to block my path toward the parking area. You're not going anywhere until we settle this privately. You're going to delete that recording, apologize to my family for your inappropriate behavior, and we're going to pretend this never happened. The audacity of his demands was breathtaking. Even faced with evidence of his crimes, he was still trying to control and manipulate me. But the woman who had arrived at this reunion seeking acceptance was gone, replaced by someone who would never again allow herself to be bullied or diminished. Michael, I'm going to explain something to you very clearly, I said, looking him directly in the eyes. I'm not deleting anything. I'm not apologizing for exposing criminal behavior, and I'm definitely not pretending that this conversation never happened. What I am going to do is drive straight to the FBI field office in Savannah and provide them with evidence of federal crimes committed by you and your family. The mention of the FBI sent a visible shock through the remaining family members. Robert and William exchanged panicked glances, apparently realizing that their comfortable world of corruption and entitlement was about to come crashing down around them. You can't do this to us, Robert said, his voice filled with a mixture of rage and desperation. We've been good to you, Sarah. We welcomed you into this family, gave you a comfortable life, treated you with respect. This is how you repay our generosity. The claim that they had treated me with respect was so absurd that I almost laughed. Robert, your family has spent 3 years making me feel inadequate and unwelcome. You've laughed at my cooking, dismissed my opinions, and excluded me from any meaningful family discussions. The only generosity you've shown me is allowing me to remain ignorant of your criminal activities. We were protecting you, William interjected. We kept you away from business discussions because we didn't want you to be implicated if anything went wrong. We were thinking of your welfare. You were thinking of your own welfare, I corrected. You kept me ignorant so that I couldn't be a witness against you, and so that I could provide alibis and cover stories if your crimes were discovered. I wasn't a protected family member. I was an unwitting accomplice. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of 2 black SUVs that pulled into the circular driveway with the kind of aggressive speed that suggested official business. My heart began to race as I realized that someone had apparently called law enforcement, though I wasn't sure who or when. 6 men in dark suits emerged from the vehicles and began walking toward the backyard gathering. Even from a distance, their bearing and attire screamed federal agents, and I felt a mixture of relief and terror as I realized that the situation was about to escalate far beyond a family confrontation. The lead agent approached our group with the calm confidence of someone who was accustomed to dealing with hostile situations. He was a tall man in his 40s with graying hair and the kind of steady gaze that suggested he had seen every type of criminal and every type of excuse. Good afternoon, he said, pulling out a leather credential case and displaying his identification. I'm Special Agent David Coleman with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We received a report of ongoing criminal activity at this location, and we're here to investigate those allegations. The silence that followed his introduction was absolute.
2 federal agents arrived at my door exactly 10 minutes after Coleman's call, introducing themselves as Agents Martinez and Thompson. They escorted me through the hotel's service entrance to avoid the media circus gathering in the main lobby, and within 20 minutes I was sitting in the back of an unmarked sedan driving through the outskirts of Savannah toward an undisclosed location. The safe house turned out to be a modest ranch home in a quiet suburban neighborhood about 30 miles outside the city. It looked completely ordinary from the outside, but inside, I discovered sophisticated security systems, reinforced windows, and communication equipment that made it clear this wasn't just temporary accommodation. Agent Coleman was waiting for me in the living room, along with a woman I hadn't met before, who introduced herself as Agent Patricia Sanchez, a specialist in organized crime investigations. Their serious expressions told me that the situation had escalated significantly since our interview the previous day. Mrs. Mitchell, I need to brief you on some developments that occurred overnight, Agent Coleman began, gesturing for me to sit down at the dining room table where they had spread out photographs and documents. Our raids on the Henderson properties yielded evidence of criminal activities that go far beyond what you overheard at the family reunion. Agent Sanchez opened a thick file folder and began laying out photographs that made my stomach turn. bank records showing millions of dollars in suspicious transactions, correspondence with known organized crime figures, and most disturbing of all, photographs of meetings between Robert Henderson and men who looked like they had stepped out of a crime movie. Mrs. Mitchell, the Henderson family hasn't just been bribing local officials, Agent Sanchez explained. They've been laundering money for a criminal organization that controls construction and development throughout the southeastern United States. Your husband and his father have been facilitating the movement of drug money through their legitimate development projects. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I had thought I was exposing local corruption and environmental violations. I hadn't realized that I was uncovering connections to organized crime that could put my life in serious danger. How long has this been going on? I asked, my voice barely steady. Based on the evidence we've recovered, at least 5 years, Agent Coleman replied. Possibly longer. The money laundering operation appears to have started small, with the Henderson family providing consulting services for projects funded by suspicious sources. Over time, it evolved into a sophisticated operation that processes millions of dollars annually. Agent Sanchez pulled out a photograph that made my blood run cold. It showed Michael shaking hands with a man whose face was partially obscured by sunglasses, but whose expensive suit and intimidating presence suggested he wasn't involved in legitimate business activities. Mrs. Mitchell, this photograph was taken 3 weeks ago outside a restaurant in Charleston, she explained. The man your husband is meeting with is Vincent Torino, a lieutenant in the Marchetti crime family. According to our surveillance, they've been meeting regularly for over a year. Vincent Torino. Even I had heard that name in news reports about organized crime investigations in South Carolina. The fact that Michael had been meeting with someone connected to the Marchetti family meant that I hadn't just exposed local corruption. I had potentially disrupted a major money laundering operation that generated enormous profits for dangerous criminals. Agent Sanchez, what does this mean for my safety? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. It means that you're no longer just a witness in a corruption case, she replied grimly. You're someone who has disrupted a criminal enterprise that generates millions of dollars in revenue for people who have historically responded to threats with violence. The weight of what I had unknowingly gotten myself into was overwhelming. I had thought I was standing up to my emotionally abusive husband and his corrupt family. I hadn't realized that I was threatening people who might be willing to kill to protect their criminal operations. Agent Coleman leaned forward, his expression serious but reassuring. Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to understand that we take your safety very seriously. The Federal Witness Protection Program exists specifically to protect people like you who have provided crucial information about dangerous criminal organizations. Are you saying I need to enter witness protection? I asked, the reality of completely abandoning my life and identity beginning to sink in. We're saying it's an option we want you to consider, Agent Sanchez replied. The evidence you've provided has given us the opportunity to dismantle a criminal network that we've been investigating for years. But that evidence has also made you a target for people who have substantial resources and no moral constraints about protecting their interests. As the agents continued briefing me on the scope of the criminal investigation, I learned details about the Henderson family's activities that made me realize how completely I had been deceived. Michael hadn't just been hiding corruption from me. He had been hiding involvement in a criminal enterprise that included money laundering, fraud, and connections to violent organized crime figures. The environmental violations I had overheard him discussing were just one small part of a much larger pattern of illegal activities. The Henderson family had been using their legitimate development business as a front for washing millions of dollars in criminal proceeds, creating fake construction projects and inflated contracts to justify suspicious financial transactions. Mrs. Mitchell, we've also discovered evidence that your husband has been systematically documenting your daily routines and activities. Agent Coleman said, showing me photographs that had apparently been taken of me without my knowledge. He's been tracking your movements, your friendships, and your communications for at least 6 months. The violation I felt seeing those surveillance photographs was almost worse than learning about the criminal activities. Michael had been spying on me while pretending to be a loving husband, documenting information that could potentially be used to find and harm me if I ever became a threat to his criminal associates. Why would he be surveillance me? I asked, though the answer was becoming increasingly clear. Because you were a potential liability.
Agent Sanchez explained. As his wife, you had access to information and observations that could expose their criminal activities. They needed to monitor you to ensure that you weren't becoming suspicious or asking dangerous questions. The realization that my marriage had been nothing more than a cover story for criminal activities was devastating in ways I was still trying to process. Michael hadn't just been emotionally abusive and manipulative. He had been using our relationship as camouflage for criminal activities while monitoring me like a potential enemy. There's something else you need to know, Agent Coleman said, his expression becoming even more serious. We have reason to believe that your husband has been instructed by his criminal associates to locate you and convince you to recant your statement to federal investigators. What happens if he finds me? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. That depends on how valuable his criminal associates consider their relationship with the Henderson family. Agent Sanchez replied. Best case scenario, he tries to manipulate you into changing your testimony. Worst case scenario, they decide that you're too dangerous to be allowed to testify. The clinical way she discussed the possibility of my murder was terrifying, but it also helped me understand the gravity of the situation I was facing. This wasn't just about ending my marriage or exposing local corruption. This was about dismantling a criminal organization that generated enormous profits for people who had killed to protect their interests in the past. My phone rang, interrupting the briefing, and Agent Coleman gestured for me to answer it while he activated recording equipment to monitor the call. The number was Michael's, and I felt my heart race as I realized this might be the contact attempt the agents had been expecting. Sarah, thank God. Michael's voice was shaky and desperate when I answered. Baby, I've been looking for you everywhere. We need to talk about what happened yesterday. There are things you don't understand, and I need to explain everything before you make any decisions you'll regret. Michael, I understand perfectly, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady while the agents listened intently. I understand that you've been lying to me about who you are and what you do for a living. I understand that you've been using our marriage as cover for criminal activities. Sarah, please just tell me where you are so we can meet and discuss this privately. The things you think you know aren't the whole story. Yes, my family has bent some rules, but we're not criminals. We're business people who sometimes have to work within imperfect systems. The casualness with which he described criminal activities as bending rules was infuriating, but I could hear something else in his voice that I had never heard before, genuine fear. Michael wasn't just trying to manipulate me into protecting him. He was terrified of what his criminal associates might do if I continued cooperating with federal investigators. Michael, I'm not going to meet with you, I said firmly, and I'm not going to help you cover up federal crimes. If you want to explain yourself, you can do it through your attorney during your federal trial. Sarah, you don't understand what you're dealing with. Michael's voice became urgent and pleading. These aren't just business associates I work with. These are dangerous people who don't forgive and don't forget. If you continue with this federal investigation, you're putting yourself in danger that I might not be able to protect you from. The irony of Michael claiming he wanted to protect me from dangers that existed because of his own criminal choices was almost laughable. But the fear in his voice was real, and it confirmed what the federal agents had been telling me about the serious risks I was facing. Michael, if these people are as dangerous as you're claiming, then they need to be in prison, I replied. And if you're working with them, then you need to be in prison too. God damn it, Sarah, I'm trying to save your life, Michael shouted, his desperation overriding his attempts at manipulation. Do you think this is some kind of game? Do you think federal agents can protect you from people who have been killing to protect their business interests for decades? Michael, the only person who put my life in danger is you, I said, feeling a surge of anger that overcame my fear. You chose to work with criminals. You chose to launder their money. You chose to lie to me about who you really are. I didn't create this situation. I just refused to continue being an unwitting accomplice to it. The call ended abruptly as Michael apparently realized that I wasn't going to be manipulated into protecting him. Agent Coleman turned off the recording equipment and exchanged meaningful glances with Agent Sanchez. Mrs. Mitchell, that call confirmed several things we suspected about your husband's situation, Agent Coleman said. He's clearly under pressure from his criminal associates to neutralize the threat you represent.
His fear seems genuine, which suggests that these people have made it clear what will happen to him if he can't control the situation. What does that mean for me? I asked. It means that your husband is now desperate, and desperate people make unpredictable choices. Agent Sanchez replied. It also means that his criminal associates are taking this investigation very seriously and are likely to escalate their efforts to protect their interests. The agents spent the next several hours walking me through enhanced security protocols and discussing the possibility of entering formal witness protection. The idea of completely abandoning my identity and relocating to an unknown location was terrifying, but it was becoming increasingly clear that it might be necessary to ensure my survival. Mrs. Mitchell, we want you to understand that witness protection isn't just about physical safety, Agent Coleman explained. It's about giving you the opportunity to rebuild your life away from the criminal environment that has been controlling and manipulating you. Many witnesses find that the program gives them a chance to discover who they really are when they're not living in fear. As the afternoon progressed, I began to understand the full scope of the federal investigation that my revelations had triggered. The Henderson family's criminal activities were just one part of a larger network that included corrupt officials, money laundering operations, and connections to organized crime families throughout the southeastern United States. Mrs. Mitchell, the evidence you've provided has given us probable cause to investigate criminal activities in 3 states. Agent Sanchez explained, showing me organizational charts that mapped out connections between various criminal enterprises. We're looking at potential charges against over 40 individuals, including government officials, business leaders, and known organized crime figures. The scale of the investigation was staggering, and I realized that my decision to expose Michael's crimes had set in motion a law enforcement operation that would take years to complete. I wasn't just a witness in a local corruption case. I was a key source in a major federal investigation of organized crime. My phone rang again, this time displaying a number I didn't recognize. Agent Coleman gestured for me to answer while they prepared to record the conversation, but what I heard when I picked up made my blood run cold. Mrs. Henderson, a voice with a slight accent said calmly. My name is Vincent Torino. I believe you know who I am. The mention of the organized crime figure whose photograph I had seen earlier made my hands shake as I held the phone. Agent Coleman immediately began signaling other agents who were monitoring communications from a separate room. Mr. Torino, I don't know why you're calling me, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite my terror. Mrs. Henderson, you have something that belongs to me, Torino continued in the same calm tone. Information that was obtained through violation of confidentiality agreements that your husband signed with my organization. I'm calling to discuss how we might resolve this situation in a way that benefits everyone involved. The casual way he discussed criminal activities as business arrangements was chilling, but what terrified me most was the implication that he knew exactly where I was and how to contact me despite federal protection. Mr. Torino, I don't have anything that belongs to you, I said. I reported criminal activities that I observed to appropriate law enforcement authorities. That's not theft. That's civic responsibility. Mrs. Henderson, I think you misunderstand the nature of our conversation, Torino replied, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge. This isn't a negotiation about legal or ethical principles. This is a business discussion about practical realities. You have disrupted operations that generate substantial revenue for my organization. That disruption needs to be corrected. Agent Coleman was frantically signaling other agents while scribbling notes about tracing the call and implementing emergency security protocols. The fact that a known organized crime figure had somehow obtained my direct phone number suggested that the federal protection I was receiving might not be as secure as the agents had believed. Mr. Torino, you need to discuss your business concerns with federal law enforcement, I said, following hand signals from Agent Coleman about prolonging the conversation. I'm not involved in any business arrangements with your organization, Mrs.
Henderson, your husband assured my organization that you could be trusted to keep confidential information. Confidential, Torino said. He guaranteed that you wouldn't become a problem for our business operations. Now that you've violated that agreement, we need to discuss how to minimize the damage you've caused.
The revelation that Michael had apparently given his criminal associates assurances about my trustworthiness was another layer of betrayal that I was still trying to process. He had been using our marriage not just as cover for his criminal activities, but as a guarantee to dangerous people that I wouldn't expose their operations. Mr. Torino, I never agreed to keep anyone's criminal activities confidential, I replied. My husband lied to your organization about my knowledge and my willingness to protect criminals. Mrs. Henderson, I'm going to make you a very generous offer, Torino said, his voice becoming businesslike in a way that was somehow more frightening than direct threats. You're going to call federal investigators and tell them that you misunderstood the conversations you overheard. You're going to explain that your husband's family are legitimate business people who you wrongly accused because of marital problems. And if I refuse? I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. Mrs. Henderson, I don't think you want to know the answer to that question, Torino replied calmly, but I will tell you this. My organization has been operating successfully for over 50 years because we're very good at solving problems that threaten our business interests. You've become a problem, Mrs. Henderson. We prefer to solve problems through reasonable discussions, but we have other methods available if necessary. The call ended abruptly, leaving me staring at my phone, while federal agents rushed around implementing emergency security protocols. Within minutes, Agent Coleman was explaining that we needed to relocate immediately to a more secure facility, while other agents worked to trace the call and investigate how Torino had obtained my contact information. Mrs. Mitchell, this changes everything, Agent Sanchez said as she helped me gather my belongings. Vincent Torino doesn't make direct contact with witnesses unless he's preparing to escalate his response to a threat. The fact that he called you personally means that his organization considers you a serious enough problem to warrant high-level attention. As federal agents escorted me to yet another vehicle for transportation to a more secure location, I realized that my life as Sarah Mitchell was effectively over. Whether I entered formal witness protection or not, I would never be able to return to the comfortable but naive existence I had been living in Savannah. The woman who had arrived at a family reunion seeking acceptance had become someone who was being hunted by organized crime figures who had killed to protect their interests in the past. But despite the terror and uncertainty, I felt a strange sense of clarity about my situation. For the first time in my adult life, I was facing a crisis that had nothing to do with trying to please people who would never respect me. This was about survival, justice, and the fundamental choice between doing what was right and doing what was safe. The safe house we were taken to was significantly more secure than the previous location, with armed guards, sophisticated surveillance systems, and communication equipment that looked like it belonged in a spy movie. As Agent Coleman briefed me on enhanced security protocols, I began to understand that I was no longer just a witness in a criminal investigation. I was someone whose continued existence threatened a criminal organization that generated millions of dollars in illegal profits. Mrs. Mitchell, we're going to arrange for you to meet with federal prosecutors tomorrow morning, Agent Coleman explained. They need to understand the scope of the threats you're facing and the value of the testimony you can provide. Based on those discussions, we'll make final decisions about witness protection and long-term security arrangements. That evening, as I sat in a heavily guarded safe house eating takeout food and trying to process the magnitude of what had happened to my life, I received an unexpected phone call from Rebecca, Michael's sister. Agent Coleman allowed the call to proceed while monitoring the conversation for any signs that she was being coerced or manipulated by other family members. Sarah, I need you to know something, Rebecca said, her voice filled with exhaustion and fear. After the FBI raids yesterday, Michael disappeared. Daddy thinks he's either hiding from federal agents or from the criminals he's been working with. No one in the family knows where he is. The news that Michael had vanished added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. If he was hiding from his criminal associates, it suggested that they blamed him for my decision to cooperate with federal investigators. If he was hiding from law enforcement, it meant he was now a federal fugitive who would be even more desperate and unpredictable. Rebecca, are you safe? I asked, genuinely concerned about her welfare despite everything that had happened. I don't know, she replied honestly. FBI agents have been interviewing family members all day, and some of the questions they're asking suggest that this criminal investigation goes back years.
Sarah, I think some of us have been as blind to what was really happening as you were. Rebecca, if you need help or protection, you should contact Agent Coleman, I said. If your family has been working with organized crime figures, then innocent family members might be in danger too. Sarah, there's something else, Rebecca said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Before Michael disappeared, he told me that he's been trying to protect you from people who want to hurt you. He said that his business associates blame you for disrupting their operations, and that they're planning to make you pay for the damage you've caused. The confirmation that organized crime figures were actively planning retaliation against me was terrifying, but it also reinforced my decision to continue cooperating with federal investigators. These were people who had threatened my life because I had exposed their criminal activities. They deserved to be in prison, regardless of the personal cost to me. Rebecca, tell Michael that if he wants to protect me, he should surrender to federal agents and provide complete cooperation with their investigation, I said. The only way to stop dangerous criminals is to ensure that they're prosecuted and imprisoned. After the call ended, Agent Coleman sat down with me to discuss the implications of Michael's disappearance and the ongoing threats to my safety. Mrs. Mitchell, your husband's decision to go into hiding suggests that he's caught between federal law enforcement and his criminal associates. That makes him unpredictable and potentially desperate enough to do things he might not normally consider. What kinds of things? I asked, though I suspected I didn't want to know the answer. Desperate people sometimes try to eliminate the sources of their problems, Agent Sanchez replied grimly. Your husband knows that your testimony is the foundation of the federal case against him and his criminal associates. If something happened to you, it would significantly complicate the prosecution's ability to prove their case. The implication that my own husband might be considering harming me to protect his criminal associates was almost too much to process. But it was consistent with everything else I had learned about the man I had married. He had never seen me as a person deserving of love and respect. I had always been nothing more than a useful tool for accomplishing his goals. As I prepared for another sleepless night in a federal safe house, I reflected on how completely my understanding of my own life had changed in just 3 days. The woman who had worried about impressing her husband's family with homemade desserts now had to worry about staying alive long enough to testify against organized crime figures who laundered millions of dollars through legitimate businesses. But despite the fear and uncertainty, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with pleasing other people. I was no longer trying to earn acceptance from people who would never value me. I was fighting for justice against people who had built their wealth and power on criminal activities that harmed innocent victims. The federal investigation that had begun with my decision to expose Michael's crimes was now focused on dismantling a criminal network that had operated with impunity for decades. The evidence I had provided was giving law enforcement the opportunity to prosecute criminals who had previously been untouchable because of their wealth, connections, and willingness to use violence against anyone who threatened their interests. Tomorrow would bring meetings with federal prosecutors who would help determine the final scope of the charges against Michael and his criminal associates. It would also bring decisions about witness protection and the possibility of completely abandoning my identity to ensure my survival. But tonight, for the first time since my wedding day, I fell asleep knowing that I was living according to my own moral principles instead of trying to please people who saw me as nothing more than a useful fool. The woman who had been humiliated at a family reunion was becoming someone who demanded justice, regardless of the personal cost. The transformation was terrifying and liberating in equal measure, but it was authentically mine in ways that my previous life had never been. The federal courthouse in Atlanta was a fortress of steel and glass that seemed to pierce the morning sky like a monument to justice. As our convoy of black SUVs pulled into the secured underground garage, I felt the weight of what was about to happen settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. Today I would face Vincent Torino and his associates in federal court, delivering testimony that could send them to prison for the rest of their lives. 6 months had passed since that devastating family reunion in Savannah. 6 months of living under assumed names, sleeping in safe houses, and working with federal prosecutors to build an airtight case against the criminal organization that had controlled construction and development throughout the Southeast for decades.
The woman who had once worried about making perfect peach cobbler was now the star witness in the largest organized crime prosecution in Georgia's history. Agent Coleman walked beside me as we made our way through the courthouse's labyrinthine security corridors. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, using the name I had adopted through the Witness Protection Program, "remember that you're not just testifying about what you overheard at that family reunion. You're speaking for every honest business owner who lost contracts to corrupt bidding processes, every family who unknowingly bought homes built on contaminated land, and every taxpayer whose money was stolen through fraudulent government contracts." The new identity felt strange but liberating. Sarah Patterson had a strength and confidence that Sarah Mitchell had never possessed. She was a woman who had survived threats from organized crime figures, contributed to dismantling a criminal empire, and rebuilt her life according to her own values rather than other people's expectations. The prosecution team had prepared me extensively for this moment. Assistant United States Attorney Maria Rodriguez had spent weeks walking me through every detail of my testimony, helping me understand how each piece of evidence connected to the larger pattern of criminal activity that had generated millions in illegal profits. The case they had built was comprehensive and devastating, incorporating financial records, surveillance footage, recorded conversations, and testimony from multiple witnesses who had found the courage to come forward after my initial revelations. "Mrs. Patterson, you need to understand the significance of what you've accomplished," Rodriguez had told me during one of our preparation sessions. The Torino organization had operated with impunity for over 20 years because they intimidated or eliminated anyone who threatened their interests. "Your decision to testify despite their threats has inspired other witnesses to come forward with evidence we never could have obtained otherwise." The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members of other victims, and law enforcement officials who had worked on various aspects of the investigation. I caught sight of Rebecca in the gallery, her face showing the strain of months spent dealing with her family's destruction and her brother's continued fugitive status. Michael had never been found, despite an extensive manhunt by federal agents. Some investigators believed he had been killed by his former criminal associates, while others suspected he had fled the country using false documents provided by the same network he had helped operate. Vincent Torino sat at the defendant's table with an expression of calm arrogance that suggested he still believed his wealth and connections would protect him from meaningful consequences. He was smaller than I had expected, a man in his 60s with silver hair and expensive clothes that couldn't disguise the calculating coldness in his eyes. When our gazes met across the courtroom, he smiled slightly, as if to remind me that he still considered me a problem to be solved rather than a witness to be feared. The other defendants included Robert Henderson, who looked decades older than he had at the family reunion, William Henderson, who avoided eye contact with everyone in the courtroom, and 6 other men who had been identified as key figures in the money laundering operation. Their defense attorneys had spent months trying to discredit my testimony, arguing that I was a scorned wife seeking revenge against my husband's family, but the mountain of evidence that corroborated my account had made their character assassination attempts largely ineffective. Judge Margaret Walsh called the court to order with the same authoritative presence she had demonstrated during the preliminary hearings. She was a woman in her late 50s with a reputation for running an efficient courtroom and imposing harsh sentences on convicted criminals. Her stern expression as she surveyed the defendants suggested that she understood the significance of this prosecution and was prepared to ensure that justice was served appropriately. "The prosecution may call its next witness," Judge Walsh announced, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "Your Honor, the United States calls Sarah Patterson," Rodriguez said, rising from the prosecution table with confident authority. Walking to the witness stand felt like moving through a dream where every step was simultaneously significant and surreal. The bailiff administered the oath with practiced efficiency, and I placed my hand on the Bible while promising to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was swearing to honesty while using an assumed name, but the Witness Protection Program had made that deception necessary for my survival. Rodriguez began her questioning with background information about my marriage to Michael Henderson and my gradual integration into the family's social circle. She walked me through the years of feeling excluded from business discussions, the subtle signs that something wasn't quite right about the family's wealth, and the growing sense that I was being kept deliberately ignorant about important aspects of my husband's work. "Mrs. Patterson, I want to direct your attention to July 15th of last year, the date of the Henderson family reunion, Rodriguez said, her voice clear and professional. Can you describe what happened that day that led to your decision to contact federal authorities? Taking a deep breath, I began recounting the events that had changed my life forever. I described the humiliation I had felt when Michael publicly mocked my cooking efforts, the conversation I had overheard about bribing government officials, and the moment I realized that my marriage had been built on lies and criminal activities. The courtroom was completely silent as I spoke, with jurors leaning forward to catch every word of testimony that had taken enormous courage to deliver. Mrs. Patterson, did you understand at the time that you were overhearing discussions about federal crimes? Rodriguez asked. Yes, I did, I replied firmly. As a former high school civics teacher, I understood that bribing government officials constitutes federal corruption charges, and that covering up environmental violations that could harm public health represents criminal conspiracy. I knew that what I was hearing could result in serious prison sentences for everyone involved. Rodriguez then walked me through the recording I had made of the conversation, playing it for the jury while I identified voices and explained the context of various statements. Hearing Michael's casual discussion of criminal activities played in open court was still painful, but it no longer carried the emotional devastation it once had. The woman testifying today was someone who had moved beyond the pain of betrayal to focus on the importance of justice. Mrs. Patterson, what happened after you confronted your husband's family with your knowledge of their criminal activities? Rodriguez continued. I described the chaos that had erupted at the family reunion, the FBI investigation that followed, and the threats I had received from Vincent Torino and his associates. The jury listened intently as I explained how my decision to report corruption had led to the discovery of a sophisticated money laundering operation that had processed millions of dollars in criminal proceeds. Mrs. Patterson, the defendant Vincent Torino contacted you directly by telephone, is that correct? Rodriguez asked, gesturing toward the defendant's table. Yes, he did, I replied, looking directly at Torino as I spoke. He told me that I had disrupted operations that generated substantial revenue for his organization, and that the disruption needed to be corrected. He offered to resolve the situation if I would recant my testimony to federal investigators. Did Mr. Torino explain what would happen if you refused his offer? Rodriguez pressed. He said that his organization had been operating successfully for over 50 years because they were very good at solving problems that threatened their business interests. He said that I had become a problem, and that while they preferred to solve problems through reasonable discussions, they had other methods available if necessary. The implication of violence was clear, and I could see several jurors exchanging concerned glances as they processed the significance of organized crime figures threatening witnesses who cooperated with law enforcement. This wasn't just about financial fraud or corruption. This was about a criminal organization that used intimidation and violence to protect their illegal operations. Rodriguez spent the next hour walking me through the evidence that connected the Henderson family's development projects to the money laundering operation. Bank records showing suspicious transactions, construction contracts with inflated costs that served no legitimate purpose, and communication between Michael and known organized crime figures painted a picture of systematic criminal activity that had operated for years without detection. Mrs. Patterson, based on your observations during your marriage, do you believe your husband understood that he was participating in money laundering activities? Rodriguez asked. Absolutely, I replied without hesitation. The conversations I overheard made it clear that Michael knew exactly who he was working with and what they expected from him. He wasn't an unwitting participant in these crimes.
He was a willing collaborator who provided legitimate business cover for criminal activities. When Rodriguez finished her direct examination, the defense attorneys began their cross-examination with the aggressive tactics I had been warned to expect. They questioned my motives for cooperating with federal investigators, suggested that I had misunderstood conversations about legitimate business activities, and implied that I was seeking revenge against my husband's family because I felt rejected by their social circle. Mrs. Patterson, isn't it true that you felt inadequate and unwelcome at Henderson family gatherings? Asked Thomas Morrison, Torino's lead defense attorney. Yes, that's true, I replied calmly. But feeling unwelcome at social gatherings doesn't change the fact that I overheard discussions about bribing government officials and laundering money for criminal organizations. Mrs. Patterson, you've admitted that you were excluded from family business discussions, Morrison continued. How can you claim to understand the context of conversations about complex business transactions? Mr. Morrison, I may have been excluded from business discussions, but I wasn't excluded from learning the difference between legal and illegal activities. I replied, paying government officials to approve permits without proper environmental review isn't a complex business transaction, it's bribery. Morrison spent over an hour trying to discredit my testimony, but the extensive evidence that corroborated my account made his efforts largely futile. Phone records confirmed the timing of threatening calls I had received, financial documents supported my descriptions of suspicious transactions, and surveillance footage showed meetings between Michael and known criminal figures that occurred exactly when I had testified they took place. When the cross-examination finally ended, I felt a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. The months of preparation had paid off, and I had delivered testimony that clearly and convincingly described the criminal activities I had witnessed. The defense attorney's attempts to portray me as a vindictive ex-wife had failed to undermine the substantial evidence that supported my account. Judge Walsh called a brief recess, and Agent Coleman escorted me to a secure conference room where Rodriguez and other members of the prosecution team were waiting with expressions of satisfaction and gratitude. Mrs. Patterson, that was outstanding testimony, Rodriguez said, shaking my hand warmly. You remained calm under aggressive cross-examination, and you articulated the evidence clearly and convincingly. The jury understood exactly what you witnessed and why it constitutes federal crimes. The trial continued for 3 more weeks, with additional witnesses providing testimony about various aspects of the criminal conspiracy. Environmental inspectors described how they had been pressured to ignore contamination that should have prevented development approvals. Banking officials explained how suspicious transactions had been disguised as legitimate business activities. Other law enforcement officers testified about surveillance operations that had documented meetings between the defendants and known organized crime figures. The most dramatic moment came when Antonio Marchetti, Vincent Torino's former associate, testified for the prosecution after agreeing to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Marchetti provided inside details about how the money laundering operation worked, including specific information about Michael's role in creating false construction contracts and inflated invoices that justified suspicious financial transactions. Michael Henderson was more than just a front for our operations, Marchetti testified. He was an active participant who helped design the financial structures we used to wash money through legitimate development projects. He understood exactly what we were doing and why it was necessary for our business model. Marchetti's testimony definitively established that Michael had been a willing participant in organized crime activities, rather than an unwitting victim of criminal manipulation. It also provided crucial details about the scope and sophistication of the money laundering operation that prosecutors needed to prove their case against all the defendants. When the prosecution rested its case, the defense attorneys presented arguments that focused primarily on technical legal challenges rather than disputes about the facts. They argued that some of the evidence had been obtained improperly, that certain financial transactions could be interpreted as legitimate business activities, and that their clients had been entrapped by overzealous federal investigators. But the mountain of evidence that supported the prosecution's case made these arguments largely ineffective. The jury had heard clear, convincing testimony from multiple witnesses, seen documentary evidence that established a pattern of criminal activity, and listened to recorded conversations that demonstrated criminal intent. The defense team's technical objections couldn't overcome the fundamental reality that their clients had been caught engaging in sophisticated criminal activities. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all major charges against all defendants. Vincent Torino was convicted of racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that carried a potential sentence of life in prison. Robert and William Henderson were convicted of bribery, fraud, and money laundering charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. When Judge Walsh read the verdicts aloud, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction, relief, and sadness. Justice had been served, but it had come at an enormous personal cost that had required me to abandon my previous life and identity.
The criminal organization that had threatened my safety had been dismantled, but my husband remained a fugitive whose fate was unknown. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later, providing an opportunity for victims to describe how the defendant's criminal activities had affected their lives. I chose not to make a victim impact statement, feeling that my testimony during the trial had already accomplished what I needed to say. Instead, I watched from the gallery as other victims described losing their homes to contaminated land, their businesses to corrupt bidding processes, and their faith in government institutions to systematic bribery. Judge Walsh imposed sentences that reflected the seriousness of the crimes and the need to deter similar criminal activity. Vincent Torino received life in prison without the possibility of parole. Robert Henderson was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. William Henderson received 20 years. The other defendants received sentences ranging from 10 to 15 years, ensuring that none of them would be able to resume their criminal activities for decades. As the defendants were led away in handcuffs, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that devastating family reunion in Savannah. The woman who had once desperately sought acceptance from people who would never respect her had become someone who demanded justice regardless of personal cost. The wife who had been manipulated and deceived had transformed into a federal witness whose courage had inspired others to come forward with evidence against dangerous criminals. The Witness Protection Program had given me a new identity, but more importantly, it had given me the opportunity to discover who I really was when I wasn't trying to please people who saw me as nothing more than a useful tool. Sarah Patterson was stronger, more confident, and more authentic than Sarah Mitchell had ever been. Walking out of the federal courthouse for the final time, I felt a sense of closure that had been months in coming. The criminal organization that had threatened my life had been destroyed. The corrupt officials who had betrayed public trust had been imprisoned. The family that had manipulated and deceived me had faced appropriate consequences for their choices. My marriage to Michael Henderson was officially over, ended by divorce proceedings that had been complicated by his fugitive status but ultimately successful. The comfortable lifestyle I had enjoyed in Savannah was gone, replaced by a modest but authentic existence that reflected my own values rather than other people's expectations. But I had gained something far more valuable than material comfort or social status. I had reclaimed my integrity, my self-respect, and my ability to make decisions based on moral principles rather than fear or desperation to belong. The woman who had been humiliated at a family reunion had become someone who shocked everyone by refusing to be silenced, intimidated, or destroyed by people who had underestimated her strength and determination. The transformation had been painful and dangerous, but it had also been the most authentic thing I had ever done. For the first time in my adult life, I was living as myself rather than as someone else's version of who I should be. 2 years later, I stood behind the podium at the National Whistleblower Conference in Washington, D.C., looking out at an auditorium filled with federal agents, prosecutors, and ordinary citizens who had found the courage to expose corruption in their own communities. The woman speaking today bore little resemblance to the one who had once trembled while making peach cobbler for a family that would never accept her. "My name is Sarah Patterson," I began, my voice steady and confident. "And I want to tell you about the day I stopped trying to belong and started demanding justice." The audience listened intently as I shared the condensed version of my story, the humiliation, the discovery, the threats, and ultimately the triumph. But what resonated most with people wasn't the dramatic details of organized crime or federal trials. It was the simple truth that sometimes the people who underestimate you give you the greatest gift of all, the motivation to prove them wrong. After my presentation, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Patterson, I've been watching my supervisor at the city planning office take bribes for months. I've been too scared to report it because he's friends with the mayor. Your story gives me the courage to do what's right." These conversations had become the most meaningful part of my new life. The FBI had offered me a position as a consultant for their white-collar crime division, helping other witnesses prepare for testimony and understand the protection services available to them. It wasn't the teaching career I had once loved, but it was work that mattered in ways I had never imagined possible. My small apartment in Boulder, Colorado, was nothing like the antebellum mansion I had shared with Michael, but it reflected my authentic taste rather than someone else's family history. The walls were lined with books, certificates from continuing education courses, and photographs of the hiking trails I had discovered in my new home state. For the first time in years, my living space felt genuinely mine. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening while I was grading papers for the online business ethics course I taught part-time. The number was Rebecca's, though she now used her married name since distancing herself from the Henderson family scandal. "Sarah, I have news about Michael," she said without preamble. "The FBI found him." My heart stopped for a moment. "Is he alive?" "Yes, but barely. He's been living in a remote area of Montana under a false identity, apparently suffering from alcoholism and severe depression. When federal agents approached him, he didn't even try to run, he just surrendered." The image of my former husband, once so confident and manipulative, reduced to a broken fugitive hiding in the wilderness, was strangely sad. But I felt no desire to see him or offer comfort. That woman who had once defined herself through his approval was gone forever. "Sarah, there's something else," Rebecca continued. "He asked the agents to give you a message. He said he was sorry for destroying your life, and that watching you find the courage to expose his crimes made him realize what a coward he had always been." The apology felt hollow after everything he had put me through, but I recognized it as perhaps the first honest thing Michael had said in years. "Rebecca, I hope he gets the help he needs, but that chapter of my life is permanently closed." Michael's capture made headlines briefly, but the media attention was nothing compared to the circus that had surrounded the original trial. He would face decades in federal prison for his crimes, but his prosecution was almost anticlimactic compared to the dismantling of the larger criminal organization. 6 months after Michael's surrender, I received an invitation that brought my transformation full circle. The University of Georgia was establishing a new ethics program for business students, and they wanted me to serve as the inaugural director. The position would allow me to return to education while using my unique experience to teach future business leaders about the importance of integrity and the courage required to resist corruption. Moving back to Georgia felt surreal, but this time I was returning as someone who belonged to herself rather than seeking acceptance from others. The woman who had once been humiliated at a family reunion was now someone who commanded respect through her actions rather than begging for it through desperate attempts to please. The first day of my new position, I stood in front of a classroom filled with eager business students and began the semester with a simple question: who can tell me the difference between success and significance? After a few tentative responses, I shared my own answer: success is about what you accomplish for yourself. Significance is about what you accomplish for others. The most important lesson I can teach you is that integrity is the only foundation that supports both. The students didn't know the full story behind my words, but they sensed the authority that came from hard-won experience. Over the following months, I developed a curriculum that combined traditional business ethics with real-world case studies, including carefully anonymized versions of situations I had personally witnessed. One evening, as I was finishing preparations for the next day's lecture on corporate responsibility, my assistant knocked on my office door. "Professor Patterson, there's someone here to see you. She says it's personal." The visitor was Lisa, Michael's cousin's wife, from Charleston, the same woman whose condescending sympathy had triggered my explosion at the family reunion. She looked older and more subdued than I remembered, her previous arrogance replaced by what appeared to be genuine humility. "Sarah, I know I have no right to be here," she began, her voice lacking the patronizing tone I remembered so well. "But I needed to tell you something that I should have said years ago." I gestured for her to sit down, curious about what could have motivated this unexpected visit. The night of the family reunion, after everything happened, I went home and told my husband that you were crazy for making such ridiculous accusations, Lisa continued. But over the following weeks, as the FBI investigation unfolded, I realized that you had been the only honest person in that entire gathering. Everyone else was either criminal or willfully blind to criminal activity. She paused, struggling with emotions that seemed genuine rather than manipulative. "Sarah, I spent years making you feel small because it made me feel superior. I mocked your cooking, dismissed your opinions, and treated you like you weren't smart enough to understand our sophisticated world. But the truth is, you were the only one among us who had the intelligence to recognize criminal behavior and the courage to do something about it. The apology was unexpected and frankly unnecessary. The woman who had once been wounded by Lisa's condescension no longer needed her approval or validation. "Lisa, I appreciate you coming here," I replied calmly. "But you should know that I don't define myself by other people's opinions anymore. What happened at that reunion wasn't about you or anyone else in Michael's family. It was about me finally finding the courage to trust my own judgment and act according to my own values." Lisa nodded, understanding that this wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation, but about closure. "Sarah, there's one more thing," she said as she prepared to leave. "Rebecca wanted me to tell you that she's proud to have you as a sister-in-law, even if only in memory. She said that watching you stand up to all of us taught her what real strength looks like." After Lisa left, I walked to my office window and looked out at the campus where I was building a new career focused on teaching integrity to the next generation of business leaders. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, reminding me of those Georgia summers when I had felt so desperate to belong somewhere that I had nearly lost myself completely. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. James Morrison, the colleague who had become something much more meaningful over the past year. Unlike Michael, James valued my strength rather than trying to diminish it, supported my work rather than competing with it, and treated me as an equal partner rather than a useful accessory. "Dinner tonight? I want to hear about your first week as department director," his message read. "Absolutely," I replied, smiling at the simplicity of honest communication between people who respected each other. As I gathered my things to leave the office, I caught my reflection in the window and saw someone I barely recognized from the woman who had attended that fateful family reunion. This person stood straight, spoke with authority, and commanded respect through competence, rather than seeking approval through compliance. The transformation hadn't been easy or comfortable, but it had been authentic in ways my previous life never was. Sometimes the people who try to humiliate you end up giving you the greatest gift possible, the motivation to discover who you really are when you stop trying to be who they want you to be. Walking across campus toward my car, I realized that the woman who had once been desperate to fit in with a criminal family had become someone who inspired others to find their own courage. The voice that had once been silenced by shame and insecurity now spoke truth to power in classrooms, conferences, and courtrooms. Michael had been wrong about many things, but he had been right about one: I was shocking everyone. Just not in the way he had expected. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.
Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing as the weight of federal law enforcement descended on the Henderson family reunion. I looked around at the faces of people who had spent years making me feel small, and saw nothing but fear and panic in their expressions. "Special Agent Coleman," I said, stepping forward with my phone still in my hand. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, and I believe I'm the person who provided the information that brought you here. I have recorded evidence of federal crimes committed by members of this family." Agent Coleman's attention focused on me with laser intensity. "Mrs. Mitchell, we'd like to speak with you privately about the information you've provided. Would you be willing to accompany us for an interview?" "Absolutely," I replied without hesitation. "I have documentation of bribery, environmental violations, and conspiracy to commit federal crimes. I'm prepared to provide complete cooperation with your investigation." Michael stepped between me and Agent Coleman, his face flushed with desperation. "Agent Coleman, my wife is having some kind of emotional breakdown. She's been drinking, and she's making wild accusations based on conversations she misunderstood. None of what she's saying is true." Agent Coleman studied Michael with the kind of professional assessment that suggested he had dealt with countless suspects who tried to discredit witnesses through character assassination. "Mr. Henderson, we'll certainly take your concerns into consideration. However, we'll need to conduct our own investigation to determine the credibility of the allegations that have been made." "Sarah, please," Rebecca said, tears now streaming down her face. "Think about what you're doing. This will destroy our entire family. Daddy could go to prison. Michael could lose everything. Is whatever happened between you and Michael really worth destroying so many lives?" Looking at Rebecca's genuine anguish, I felt the weight of what I was about to set in motion. These people were criminals, but they were also a family that was about to be torn apart by investigations, prosecutions, and prison sentences.
The comfortable world they had built through corruption was about to collapse, and innocent family members like Rebecca would suffer along with the guilty ones. But then I remembered the casual way Michael had discussed bribing government officials, the environmental contamination that could harm public health, and the years of psychological manipulation that had made me doubt my own worth and judgment. These people had made their choices, and now they would face the consequences of those choices. "Rebecca, I'm sorry that you're caught up in this," I said softly. "But your father and brother committed federal crimes that could harm innocent people. The environmental contamination they covered up could affect the health of families who buy homes in that development. The corrupt approval process they used undermines the safety regulations that protect all of us." Agent Coleman gestured toward the SUVs. "Mrs. Mitchell, if you're ready, we'd like to conduct this interview at our field office where we can properly document your statement and examine the evidence you've collected." As I walked toward the government vehicles, I could hear the family members behind me beginning to panic. Robert was frantically making phone calls, probably to attorneys who specialized in federal criminal defense. William was gathering documents from his car, possibly evidence that he wanted to hide or destroy before the FBI could seize it. Michael was still trying to convince anyone who would listen that I was having a mental breakdown and couldn't be trusted. But their desperate damage control efforts were too little, too late. The comfortable world of privilege and corruption they had built was about to be examined under the harsh light of federal investigation, and I doubted it would survive the scrutiny. As I reached the SUV, I turned back to look at the Henderson family estate one last time. The magnificent antebellum mansion, the manicured gardens, and the moss-draped oak trees that had intimidated me for 3 years now looked like nothing more than expensive camouflage for a criminal enterprise. The family reunion that had begun with my humiliation was ending with their exposure, and I felt a sense of poetic justice in the reversal. Agent Coleman opened the door of the lead SUV and gestured for me to get inside. "Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to know that what you've done today takes considerable courage. Exposing criminal activity within your own family is never easy, but it's the right thing to do." As I settled into the back seat of the government vehicle, I reflected on how completely my life had changed in the span of a single afternoon. I had arrived at the reunion as Sarah Henderson, the inadequate wife who desperately wanted to belong to a family that would never fully accept her. I was leaving as Sarah Mitchell, a woman who had chosen justice over comfort and truth over belonging. The drive to the FBI field office gave me time to process what I had just done and what was likely to come next. My marriage to Michael was obviously over, destroyed not just by his criminal activities but by his systematic psychological abuse and manipulation. The comfortable lifestyle I had enjoyed as part of the Henderson family was gone, replaced by an uncertain future as a witness in a federal criminal investigation. But along with the fear and uncertainty, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: self-respect. For the first time since my wedding day, I had acted according to my own moral compass instead of trying to please people who would never value or respect me. I had chosen to do what was right instead of what was easy, and that choice felt like the first genuine decision I had made in my adult life. The FBI field office in Savannah was a modern glass building that looked nothing like the dramatic government facilities portrayed in movies and television shows. Agent Coleman led me through a series of security checkpoints and into a conference room that was furnished with nothing more than a table, chairs, and recording equipment. "Mrs. Mitchell, before we begin, I want to explain the process we're going to follow," Agent Coleman said as he activated the recording equipment. "This interview will be recorded and transcribed, and your statement will become part of the official investigation file. You have the right to have an attorney present during this interview, and you're free to stop the interview at any time if you feel uncomfortable." "I don't need an attorney," I replied. "I'm the victim of these crimes, not a perpetrator. I want to provide complete cooperation with your investigation." Agent Coleman nodded and began the formal interview process. For the next 4 hours, I provided detailed information about everything I had overheard, including specific names, dates, and dollar amounts that Michael and his family had discussed. I played the recording I had made on my phone multiple times, helping the agents identify voices and clarify statements that might be unclear. The scope of the investigation quickly expanded as I provided information that connected to other cases the FBI was already investigating. Apparently, the Henderson family's corruption was part of a larger pattern of development fraud that had been occurring throughout the coastal regions of Georgia and South Carolina. Mrs. Mitchell, the information you've provided today has given us probable cause to obtain search warrants for multiple properties and business records. Agent Coleman explained as our interview concluded. We'll be executing those warrants within the next 24 hours, and will likely need additional interviews with you as our investigation progresses. What about my safety? I asked, suddenly realizing that I might be in physical danger from people who had a lot to lose if their crimes were exposed. Michael's family has significant resources and connections throughout this state. Are you concerned that they might try to intimidate me or worse? Agent Coleman's expression became serious as he considered my question. Mrs. Mitchell, witness protection is something we take very seriously in cases involving organized criminal activity. Based on what you've told us today, we're dealing with a criminal conspiracy that involves substantial amounts of money and powerful people who have demonstrated a willingness to break federal laws. The mention of witness protection sent a chill down my spine as I realized the full implications of what I had set in motion. I wasn't just ending my marriage and exposing my husband's crimes. I was potentially entering a world of federal marshals, relocated identities, and constant fear for my physical safety. However, Agent Coleman continued, we don't believe you're in immediate physical danger. The Henderson family's criminal activities appear to be focused on financial fraud and corruption rather than violence. We'll be monitoring the situation closely, and will provide protection if circumstances change. As the interview concluded and Agent Coleman prepared to escort me back to the parking garage, I realized that I had no idea where I was supposed to go next. My marriage was over, my relationship with Michael's family was destroyed, and I couldn't return to the house I had shared with Michael without risking confrontation or potential danger. Agent Coleman, I need to ask for some practical advice, I said as we walked toward the elevators. I can't go home to the house I share with Michael, and I don't have family in this area. Do you have suggestions for where I should stay while this investigation unfolds? Mitchell, we can recommend several hotels that have experience providing accommodation for federal witnesses, he replied. We can also provide assistance with securing your personal belongings from your marital home once we've executed our search warrants and the immediate investigation activities are complete. The drive to the hotel that Agent Coleman recommended gave me time to call my parents in Athens and explain what had happened. The conversation was difficult and emotional, but my mother's reaction was immediately supportive. Sarah, honey, we've been worried about you for months, she said, her voice filled with relief and concern. Your father and I both felt like you'd been changing since you married Michael, and not in a good way. You seem to be losing confidence and becoming more withdrawn every time we talk to you. Mom, I think I was losing myself, I admitted, feeling tears begin to flow for the first time since the confrontation at the reunion. I was so desperate to fit in with Michael's family that I was willing to give up everything that made me who I was. I stopped teaching, stopped seeing my friends, stopped trusting my own judgment about anything. Well, it sounds like you found your judgment again just in time, my father said, having picked up the extension phone. Sarah, what you did today took more courage than most people have in their entire lives. We're proud of you for standing up for what's right, even when it cost you everything you thought you wanted. My parents offered to drive to Savannah immediately to provide support, but I asked them to wait until I had a better understanding of how the federal investigation was going to unfold. I didn't want to put them at risk if there were safety concerns, and I needed time to process what had happened and figure out what I wanted to do next. The hotel room was comfortable but sterile, nothing like the elegant bedroom I had shared with Michael in our antebellum home near the historic district. As I sat on the generic bedspread looking out at the parking lot, I tried to inventory what I had gained and lost in a single afternoon. I had lost my marriage, my comfortable lifestyle, my social position in Savannah society, and any hope of belonging to the family I had tried so desperately to impress. But I had gained something far more valuable, my self-respect and my moral integrity. For the first time in 3 years, I could look at myself in the mirror without feeling ashamed of the compromises I had made, or the person I had become. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, and my heart rate spiked as I wondered if Michael or his family had found a way to contact me despite the FBI's involvement. But the message was from Rebecca, Michael's sister, who had apparently gotten my number from someone else in the family. Sarah, I know you probably don't want to hear from any of us right now, but I needed to tell you something. After you left with the FBI agents, I confronted Daddy and Michael about what you said. They didn't deny it, they admitted that everything you accused them of was true. I'm horrified and ashamed, and I want you to know that not everyone in this family knew what was happening. Some of us are innocent victims just like you were. Reading Rebecca's message, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. Part of me was relieved to have confirmation that my accusations were accurate and that I hadn't misunderstood or misinterpreted what I had overheard. But another part of me was genuinely sorry that Rebecca and other family members were learning about their loved one's criminal activities in such a traumatic way. I composed a careful response that acknowledged her message without providing any information that could compromise the federal investigation. Rebecca, I'm sorry that you're going through this. I know it's painful to learn that people you trust have been living double lives. I hope you're taking care of yourself and seeking support from people who can help you process what you've learned. As the evening progressed, my phone continued to buzz with messages from various family members, some supportive like Rebecca's, others hostile and accusatory. Michael sent several increasingly desperate messages begging me to reconsider my cooperation with the FBI, promising to change, and threatening legal action if I continued to spread lies about his family. But the most disturbing message came from an unknown number with a simple warning. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. Some secrets are too dangerous to expose. I immediately forwarded the threatening message to Agent Coleman, who called me within minutes to discuss the situation. Mrs. Mitchell, we're taking this threat very seriously. We're going to arrange for increased security at your hotel, and we want you to report any suspicious activity or contact immediately. The reality of potential physical danger made the abstract concept of witness protection suddenly very concrete and frightening. I was no longer just a woman who had exposed her husband's crimes. I was someone who had threatened powerful people with substantial resources and potentially violent associates. As I tried to fall asleep in the unfamiliar hotel room, I reflected on how completely my life had changed in less than 12 hours. I had awakened that morning as a woman preparing to attend a family reunion with homemade desserts and hopes for acceptance. I was ending the day as a federal witness under protection, having exposed a criminal conspiracy and destroyed the life I had been living for 3 years. But despite the fear and uncertainty, I felt a peace that I hadn't experienced since my wedding day. For the first time in years, I was living according to my own values, instead of trying to please people who would never respect or value me. I had chosen justice over comfort, truth over belonging, and integrity over security. The woman who had been humiliated at a family reunion that morning had become someone who demanded justice and refused to be silenced or intimidated. The investigation that would unfold over the coming weeks and months would test my resolve and potentially put me in danger, but I was ready to face whatever came next. I had finally found my voice, and I wasn't going to let anyone silence it again. The sound of helicopters circling overhead woke me at 5:30 in the morning. Through the hotel room curtains, I could see news vans lining the street and reporters setting up cameras in the parking lot. Somehow, word of the FBI raid on the Henderson properties had leaked to the media, and my quiet night of processing what had happened was about to become a very public nightmare. Agent Coleman called my room within minutes of my waking up. "Mrs. Mitchell, we need to move you to a more secure location immediately. The media attention has compromised your safety, and we've received intelligence suggesting that certain individuals connected to your husband's criminal activities are actively looking for you." The urgency in his voice sent ice through my veins. "What kind of individuals, Agent Coleman? Are we talking about more family members, or something worse?" "We'll discuss the details once you're secure," he replied. "Pack only essential items. We'll have agents at your door in 10 minutes to escort you to a safe house." As I hurriedly gathered my belongings, I caught glimpses of the news coverage on the hotel room television. The morning shows were leading with breaking news about the FBI raids on multiple Henderson properties throughout Savannah and the surrounding counties. Aerial footage showed federal agents carrying boxes of evidence from the family's antebellum mansion, while other shots captured similar scenes at Robert Henderson's downtown office building and Michael's development company headquarters. The news anchors were describing it as one of the largest corruption investigations in Georgia's recent history, involving millions of dollars in fraudulent development deals and systematic bribery of government officials. They mentioned that the investigation had been triggered by a whistleblower within the Henderson family, but thankfully they hadn't yet identified me by name.